welcome to the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Michael Wilson. Michael, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks, Lewis. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm super excited for this one. We're going to get into all things relationships for men, what it looks like after a breakdown, and sort of maybe some of the pitfalls that can be avoided from that. But first, Michael, in your own words, what makes you a man?
Yeah, big question to start with. I think I was reflecting a lot on this and sort of, what was coming up for me in thinking about it. And I suppose for me, it's maybe less about what makes me a man and more what makes me feel comfortable as a man that I am, I suppose. And I guess what I mean by that is in going through adolescence and kind of figuring out my identity and who I was and everything like that, I guess for a long time, I think I was surrounded by people who were maybe reinforcing a model of my masculinity and my sense of being a man that wasn't really compatible with my identity or sort of, my true self, I suppose. So I guess, maybe to be a bit less needlessly vague, I'm gay, and for a long time, though those were two words that I didn't think I'd ever be able to say. And I think, in a way, this feeling that maybe I couldn't or shouldn't acknowledge that part of my identity and that part of, being a man for me, I feel like that was inadvertently reinforced, I think, by the people I was around and the situations I was in growing up. And I suppose, to give you an example, I think like at uni, for example, living on campus, I think there was this expectation that, you were sleeping with as many girls as possible. And that was how you, would succeed as a young man at uni. And obviously I had very little interest in doing that. So I think, I'm in a position today where I'm very lucky and thankful to say that I'm surrounded by so many, wonderful friends and family and colleagues and everything that really celebrate the man that I am today and really support that. And, that hasn't always been the case. And it's definitely not the case for everyone in my sort of situation. But I suppose that's what sort of came up for me.
I asked that question because I see that question a little bit for some men as a coming out as well. Like some people never ask that question, right? When you do come out, like I've spoken to a number of friends around it, and it's extremely freeing, right? And I think to then ask that question as a man, I think is also really freeing, because whether you're in a heterosexual or a gay sort of relationship, or that's your leaning, you still need to ask that question. There's still things that you can put up, and I really do like that question, because for me, I didn't ask it to myself till I was in my 30s, and it felt freeing and a bit, but like I say, a bit of a coming out. Obviously, not to the same extreme, but it is sort of an awakening of what you want to sort of hold on to as a man, I guess, which is
totally. I think a lot of people's maybe first reaction to that, which interestingly in some research that we've done, we did a big survey asking 2,000 guys in Australia, just with an open text question, what does it mean, or what does being a man mean to you? And I think something like 40% of the guys said having a penis, and that was it. And so I think what that really shows is, how rare I think it is for a lot of guys to really introspect deeply about their relationship to masculinity and about situations where they feel like they're being maybe pushed to conform to certain models of, maybe not necessarily even manhood, but just behavior that aligns to expectations of manhood. And it takes some sort of, work to really work that out and to understand it. But I think the insight and the learning and the self-development that can come from doing that is really powerful.
Michael, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about what it is that you do?
Sure. So I'm a researcher. So I'm based with the University of Melbourne, and my research focuses on men's mental health and suicide prevention. So for the last, 8 years or so, I've been working in this area, really focused on, as I said, trying to understand interactions between men's mental health and gender role norms, so particularly understanding links with masculinity and gender socialization, and I guess flow-on links with men's suicide risk, recognizing that, men account for 3 in every 4 suicides, obviously a critical issue. I think you can't talk about men's health without talking about suicide. And so across that time, I've been very lucky to work across a range of different areas of men's health research, both focusing on men themselves and understanding men's individual risk factors and what mental health looks like for guys, but also understanding the systems that are around men and the ways in which healthcare systems and healthcare practitioners, psychologists and GPs, for example, the ways in which they're actually responding to men when they do seek help and the ways that they're supporting men's mental health, to really try and make sure that the onus isn't entirely on men to seek help, but we're recognizing that there's a responsibility for the services that are meeting men on the other side. So a lot of my work is focused on that, but then also more recently I've been focusing on understanding relationship breakdown in particular, and the links between intimate partner relationship breakdown, breakup, separation and divorce, and the links between that and men's mental health issues, and particularly suicide. Which I think is really important given in Australia, 1 in 3 male suicides in men aged 25 to 44 occurs in the context of intimate partner problems, so particularly separation and divorce. So a really, really big risk factor that hasn't received enough attention. And so, my work has focused on that for the last few years.
Why do you think men are so dependent on relationships? It seems to be sort of a little bit of a joke. Men really get into relationships. They make them their life, and you talk about your breakdown with your friends and that side of things, but the core principle is if they get a partner, it tends to become their world. Is there any links to why that is?
It's a really good question. I don't think it's one of those things that isn't always exclusive to men. I just think there are particular ways that shows up for men that can create a risky situation if relationships break down. So, we know that, equally for women's relationships, if they put their entire identity into the relationship at the expense of connection and social support and things like that outside of the relationship, that can still lead to mental health, consequences when it breaks down. So it's inevitable for anyone. But I think the particular ways in which it shows up maybe slightly differently for guys sometimes is really the fact that men often rely, I guess, primarily on their romantic partner for a primary source of social and emotional support, because of the way that I think a lot of men are socialized to not necessarily feel comfortable, I guess, really opening up or connecting with other men in their lives. Which is not to say that opening up emotionally and sort of, I guess, showing quote unquote, typical vulnerability that we, stereotypically think about. It's not to say that that's essential, but I think often that sort of vulnerability is reserved for one's closest, most intimate partner. And so I think that sort of gendered pattern of connection and intimacy and communication and things like that can lead, it's something that contributes to male loneliness, for example, is the fact that, guys who don't have romantic partners and then also feel like they're socially disconnected. They might be around people, but they're not necessarily with them in a sort of connected emotional sense. So I think, these sort of processes of connection and communication and intimacy, the ways in which they are gendered and they look different for men sometimes, I think that can create risk and create risky situations if relationships break down, because we know that a lot of the time, particularly in heterosexual relationships, particularly when thinking about marriage, they're most often initiated by female partners. So this sense that often guys can be blindsided by separation or divorce, for example, and then, be left with little other connection and support to turn to, I think is really common. And it's also something that I think, it's important to think about life stage considerations and when separation is occurring, because I think there's particular times in a man's life when this risk of having no one else to turn to can be particularly prominent. So I guess, thinking about new dads, for example, we know that having a child can be a risk factor for men's mental health. There's a lot of talk about, postnatal depression in women, but it's actually really common in men as well. And I think, having a new baby is obviously something that can really strain the functioning and the health of one's intimate relationship, and often can be a contributing factor in the decline of that relationship towards separation. And so then, if we're thinking about social support as a potential key factor that protects men's mental health in the aftermath of a breakup, I think, if all of men's a guy that has a new baby and all of his friends are in that same life stage, if they're busy looking after their own kids and their work and their family and everything like that, it might create a sort of particularly risky situation where, there might be people around, but they're just not available to provide that support that he needs. So yeah, it's really complex, and it's a very difficult kind of pathway to research because it's so nuanced and there's so many factors that interact and play a role. I think the work I've done so far generally supports that pathway or the role of, I guess, loneliness and isolation and lack of social support as kind of explaining men's suicidality following relationship breakdown.
Do you think there's any causality towards breakups and the pressure that you may put on your partner when you solely rely on them from a social and an emotional point of view? Because I feel like sort of the work that I've been doing and sort of understanding, like I have no sort of facts to back it up, but directionally it sort of seems correct, where you're sort of putting that constant pressure on your partner essentially to the point where they're just like, this is too much for me. You then, like you say, other factors, you put kids on top of that are also going to have their own emotional and social demands. If that sort of becomes quite a heavy plate quite quickly, is there any links to that?
So, sorry, could you just clarify? And you said, is there causal links?
Yeah, causal to essentially putting the pressure on your partner, being a lonely guy, but you're basically putting all that pressure onto your partner. Is that one of the main causes of breakdown?
Yeah, again, it's a really difficult thing to say that there's a causal link there, again, because this is such a complex, I guess, issue and there's so many factors that play a role. It's really hard, particularly thinking about suicide, to pinpoint the one thing that might play a role. But again, I think, there's research showing that the more sort of eggs you put in that one basket of the relationship, no partner can be everything to everyone. So I think, there's real value in sort of diversifying sources of connection and support, both within and outside of that relationship. I think there's also research showing that the relationship between men's mental health and relationship quality can vary as a function of the availability of social support outside of that relationship. So I think, this research isn't necessarily about relationship breakdown, but among men who are in relationships, I think, it generally shows that those that have more support outside of the relationship, their relationship quality is better, their mental health is better. So it suggests there's a kind of interplay between the amount of support men have within their relationship that benefits from the amount they have outside. And sort of both are equally important, but in different ways and for different situations, I think.
Is there any sort of additional factors around suicide in sort of why it goes that far? So you may become an alcoholic, or you may really get into the gym, probably sort of two of the same coin.
Yeah.
But is there any sort of research onto why men go so far post a breakup?
Yeah. So that exact question is really what my work has focused on, because the primary, I guess the main research in looking at relationship breakdown and suicide, firstly, is typically focused on the question of who's more at risk. Is it men or is it women? And that focus, whilst interesting and important, has led to a real neglect of research that actually tries to understand within men as a group. We know that relationship breakdown is a really big problem for male suicide. So which men are most at risk, and what are the factors that actually play a role in understanding that risk and that pathway? And so, as I said, my work has sort of found so far that, yes, loneliness and social isolation, these sort of interpersonal impacts of relationship breakdown, can play a role in that pathway. But the other thing that's come up a lot is just the role of the sheer emotional upheaval of relationship breakdown and how painful that can feel for guys. It was one of the main things that has come up in a study I've just finished recently, that involved interviewing 22 young guys about their breakups and essentially trying to track, their paths of reaction and recovery. and what that looked like, who they turned to, how they navigated it, what they learned from that experience, and particularly trying to understand the flow of emotions through that aftermath and how they navigated and made sense of those. And I think what was really clear is those guys that experienced, came close to attempting suicide, some of them, I think what was really clear for them is just the peak and the intensity of the emotional distress that they were feeling, and particular emotions as particularly aversive. So feeling an intense sense of shame, for example, and the sense that your entire world is coming crashing down, an intense, I guess, sense of loss and losing not only your partner, but often, shared friendships and things like that. So a sense of real deep emotional loss alongside just a really deep, I guess, sadness that just is felt as so physical and so all consuming for some guys. So there's the feelings, but then there's also how guys respond to those and how they regulate those. And we know that, there's research showing that patterns and sort of skill in emotion regulation and emotional literacy and things like that are gendered. We know that boys and men relative to girls and women are sort of maybe less likely to be as in tune with their emotions or know how to respond to them adaptively and healthily regulate those. So again, some patterns of emotion regulation through like numbing and blunting emotions through drugs and alcohol and things like that, whilst it might in the moment numb what is felt, I think, a lot of the time it can just bury things that are then going to explode in other ways. And so I think that is definitely contributing to the problem as well. So yeah, for me, it seems in terms of, answering the question of why relationship breakdown is linked to male suicide, it's obviously an interaction between someone's underlying vulnerabilities and the acute consequences of relationship breakdown. And in those consequences, it seems primarily to be the social and loneliness kind of impacts and the emotional upheaval and sort of inability to regulate and respond healthily to.
I don't know how if there's any way of even doing this, but it would be really interesting. So my sort of initial question was going to be around sort of social those sort of lower on that ladder and sort of suicides, but then it got me thinking around sort of the first question, which is what makes you a man, and sort of looking at, I guess, traditional gender roles and whether that has impact on that rate as well. So like if that relationship is very much built on the traditional, I'm the man, I go and provide and I do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And then the woman leaves in a heterosexual relationship, is that then more likely to lead to a suicide or a death of despair when it comes to
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I guess it's really a question of if men are feeling shame following relationship breakdown, why are they feeling shame in particular? And where does that shame come from? And I think for a lot of guys, particularly if they have kids and they are the familiar provider and things like that, it's normal and it's quite healthy in a lot of ways to derive a sense of self-worth and purpose and value from providing for one's family and being, feeling like you are setting up a life for the people around you. Like, I think that's a really positive sort of, trait that we code as masculine. But again, I think that could be something that might be linked to, potentially why shame is such a common emotion following relationship breakdown for men, because if you're deriving such a source of your worth and identity from your relationship and your position in that relationship, and then it breaks down, and we don't necessarily have enough research to support this pathway. I should say that as a researcher. But, if you're putting all of your identity on that relationship and deriving your worth from that, it makes sense that if that relationship breaks down and you lose that source of validation and worth, what is the emotional response to lacking worth and feeling purpose? It's shame. So it makes a lot of sense. And I think shame is such a powerful emotion in men's mental health generally. It's I think one of the most aversive, intense emotional states to feel, and it can really drive people to withdraw or to respond to it through trying to, reclaim power and control. So yeah, it's a really complex emotion, but seems a really common one post breakup for guys.
Yeah, I've interviewed a few guys around testosterone levels, and how and testosterone levels peak and fall around sort of competition. So one of the sort of scary ones is if you and I said, let's have a race, both of our testosterone levels would increase by a relatively large amount because we've agreed to a fair competition. We run the race. If both parties feel that the race was fair, and I win and you lose, your testosterone will drop half the level that they were currently at, so from peak to half, and mine would go up again, and then you would retreat until your testosterone levels have reached back to the level that they were previously before you come back to the friendship group. Now, I was never told that at school, and I think that's quite useful information when you're a sort of a man when it comes to your testosterone and how that can actually affect you. But if you think about that in a relationship, you're probably testosterone's here, and then all of a sudden you've been dumped. You're gonna take a big hit, and if you start fueling that with alcohol and drugs and things like that, you're really going to struggle to bring it back to norm. And I imagine that's some quite negative thoughts. Have you done any links towards testosterone or anything like that?
No, I haven't, but it's a really interesting point. And I guess as you were talking, I was thinking about, some research showing that testosterone, because there's obviously heaps of research looking at the links between testosterone and aggression, for example, which I think, the links aren't as clear as people often assume. But I think one way that testosterone is kind of thought about is as a status-seeking hormone. So, in situations where men feel their status as a man is under threat or is devalued, and again, that could be post-breakup if they're deriving their worth and value from that relationship. It makes sense that, the hormonal, I guess, correlate of that would be, a flood of testosterone to try and get them to reinstate that status by whatever means necessary. So yeah, it's not something I've looked into, but would be very interesting for sure.
It's like testosterone for me is something that I feel needs to be spoken about more in schools. I sort of remember my sex education, and it was, here's a banana, this is how you put a condom on.
Yeah.
Make sure you ask for consent, break time. And that's not even an exaggeration. And I remember the girls being slightly longer because they were talking about periods, but there was no real conversation around, other than my voice is going to get deeper and I'm going to grow hair on my face. There was no sort of real conversation around testosterone. And the irony is that men are more susceptible to changes in their mood based on their testosterone levels. There's this sort of stereotype that women have mood swings, but it's actually day to day. Men, their levels of testosterone are what are affecting it the most. And I think just understanding allows you to be in a lot more sane place when it comes to being in a bit of a bad mood, whereas you can easily get into spirals, whether it's aggression, whether it's shame, whether it's depression, whatever it looks like. If you don't understand what's happening to your body, it's very easy to be sort of pushed down into a rabbit hole, I guess. And
absolutely,
more conversations around it, really. I find it quite fascinating for sure. Do you think that sort of there are other factors to be sort of considered in this? So we've spoken about sort of drugs and alcohol, but the other side of the coin, I guess, is that aggression. So sort of violence against women and girls. Is there an overarching study around the breakup of men, essentially, and where they sort of go post-breakup? Like move on, 10% move on, find a new partner and a happy ex do this. Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah. There is some research into that, and I think generally it's looking at, the time it takes guys to move on, often relative to women. Again, so much of the work in this space is grounded in sex differences and trying to understand differences between men and women. So it's not necessarily what I've focused on so much, but I think there is some support for the fact that I think often women are more likely to recover sooner, I think, emotionally, which could be linked to the fact that, particularly in marriage, women are more likely to initiate separation or divorce, which could suggest that they've, I guess, in advance done the emotional, coping and grieving and things like that. So maybe they have less to do after the official end. But on the question of violence, I think that's something that isn't really researched enough in this space. And I think where that kind of comes from is the way in Australia and the US, and I think the UK as well, the way that we track, I guess, I guess, monitor national statistics of suicides and the circumstances of those suicides, for example. Any sort of relationship problem or thing comes under one code as a risk factor that occurs, for example, in the 12 months prior to suicide. And that relationship, overarching code comes from the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases, which essentially records all of the different, circumstances of a death and the cause of that death and, what happened prior and everything like that. And so for me, if we have one broad overarching category of any sort of relationship problem prior to suicide, that tells us very little about what actual relationship problems might be happening. So, for example, if we're thinking about separation and divorce, that's actually only one part of what is included under this broad category. There's also conflict, there's also domestic violence, both perpetration and victimization. There's, any sort of relationship thing is all grouped into one. And I think that is really limiting our understanding of different groups of men whose, maybe their relationships broke down because they were using violence towards their partner. Maybe their relationships broke down because their partner was violent to them. We just don't know how many men are in these different groups and how many of those are then, which of those are more vulnerable to suicide than others. So, it's frustrating, and we just don't have the data to speak to those nuances at the moment. But what we do know from, I guess, the work that I've done is that violence does play a role for some men, not all by any means, but there is research showing, in some cases that the breakdown of relationships that, where violence was involved for some men, and again, potentially the shame that is driving, that violence in some cases. For some men, that violence is then turned on themselves. And, there's research talking about men's violence against women and violence against themselves as being two sides of a very dark coin of dysregulated emotionality and an inability to kind of handle, I guess, relational conflict and emotional distress. And so I think keeping these issues separate, so suicide prevention and domestic violence, keeping them separate isn't really doing justice to the reality of this issue. And I think, we have a long way to go in sort of improving our understanding here, because it's definitely a factor. We just don't know how much of a factor, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting because you said, right, like sort of in the middle of this, that there's a sort of a overarching, this is relationship, that's it, tick box. And then once later, the guy's committed suicide, but there's no more sort of in depth, and yet there's a separation around sort of everything else. So when it comes to violence and suicide, we're not saying that they're linked. And I really do think that the majority of suicides are all part of like alcohol abuse, addiction, gambling, porn, gym, like intense gym going. All of these are just this emotion coming out in whatever way that man can do it, and the dark side of it is, like you say, is suicide, which is a shame. Like it's a waste. I think it's a good thing.
Absolutely, it's tragic
for blokes to be doing, for sure. But what some of those things as well is sort of like online content and sort of getting into, I guess, rabbit holes. Sort of like a little bit of a my story. I went through some sort of horrendous mental health issues and sort of led to suicidal ideations and again put a lot of pressure on my partner at the time, but also had a role where I was essentially breadwinner for a short period of time during sort of COVID and that side of things, and that eventually led to the breakdown of the relationship. And I remember sort of sitting with those thoughts and going, this is where men start hating women. Like it sort of clicked with me where you choose this path, and it was very apparent because there was so much stuff that I'd done or I felt I'd done, and then yet the relationship had still sort of broken down, and I was arguably at my worst at that point. But it wasn't at that point. It was probably a significant point in the past that had started to lead to her decision to making that breakup. But from there, it's very easy to then get into the manosphere, I guess. Is there much research on that side of things post-breakup?
There is, yeah. I think and again, like the term manosphere, I don't love nowadays because I feel like it's used as a kind of catch-all for any sort of online space where men congregate, or any sort of content that is targeted towards men. And I think the manosphere is so broad and has so much in it that it's not really useful to kind of use these catch-all terms, because they just make people think automatically of incels, for example, when there's actually so much more in this world of online content and online spaces than that. So I'll just say that. But yes, there are links, in the sense that we know that social media algorithms are incredibly sensitive to what is going on in our lives. I think in many ways they know what's going on for us more than we do sometimes, which is quite scary, but that's the world we live in. And I think, for guys post breakup, I think that is a time when a lot of the guys I've spoken to, for example, often the first thing they did following the intense emotional upheaval, or how they responded to that, was to withdraw and to totally isolate themselves in order to make sense of what they were feeling, and to maybe protect themselves from exposing that vulnerability. And a lot of them, spent a lot more time on their phones, a lot more time online, trying to sort of make sense of what was going on for them. And there was a couple in particular that did talk about seeing a real surge in content that is sort of, often it can start out as just pop psych sort of content that, has these broad generalizations about the way men and women handle breakups and the way it all unfolds and how to respond and all of that, some of which might be useful, might help people to sort of make sense of what happened to them. But I think it can create a slippery slope where we know, algorithms push more and more radical content to try and get you watching more and more and more. And yeah, we know from some research that has looked into pathways and to, taking the red pill, for example, for some guys. And I think a history of interpersonal rejection, particularly romantic rejection, or the sense that you are lacking romantic or sexual success, that can be a really common precipitant of spending a lot more time online trying to understand why that is, and to seek some answers to try and get out of that distress. And we know that there's a real lack of positive, I guess, strength-based, healthy content that is actually grounded in evidence and is useful for guys to sort of meet that need. And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, there's a real void that is being met by some potential influencers that don't necessarily have guys' best interests at heart. I think often there's just a motivation to just get as many views and as much engagement as possible. So yes, long story short, it's definitely a common pathway, just not one that has been, I guess, sufficiently.
I guess that kind of content really attacks self-worth as well, right? It's like a magnifier of your failures. Like what they're perceiving as success is sort of similar to your uni days, right? Is how many women you can sleep with and how much money you have, and inability to, I guess, hold emotions, right? It's like everything is just, I'm the man, don't bother me. And you're in a state of emotional turmoil because it's essentially a grieving process, right? A breakup.
Yeah. Well, there's that, but there's also the narrative that what you're feeling isn't your fault, it's her fault sort of thing. And I think that sort of narrative of, and in some cases, I'm not saying that there's breakups where they aren't, where women haven't contributed to relationship breakdown. That obviously happens. But I think this narrative of anger and vitriol towards women as a whole for being somehow conniving and manipulative in relationships and, manipulating guys and just taking them for granted and stuff, again, it can happen, but I don't necessarily see how that narrative could be in the long term useful for a guy that's just gone through a breakup. I think it seems to me that the more useful path, and we know, from research into predictors of post, I guess, in a way, traumatic growth following relationship breakdown or intense emotional upheaval, really accepting what you've been through, owning your potential contribution to what you've been through, and really learning from that and taking it on as a source of positive growth rather than trying to replace the distress you're feeling with blame and anger and vitriol towards the source of that distress. I think, taking it on as a learning is definitely the more healthy, more conducive to mental health in the long run, I think. Yeah. And it's just a shame because I think a lot of this content just, tries to take the distress and vulnerability that is very real that so many guys are feeling and replace it with anger and replace it with vitriol and someone to blame, which I don't think is actually helping guys.
No, for sure. I think the flip side of that is sort of content that women are fed and that all men are narcissists. Like that seems to be quite a common trend. The amount of women that have referred to ex-partners, multiple ex-partners, as all being narcissists makes really no sense because it's statistically impossible unless you are really unlucky to have multiple partners that were narcissistic. So I think it is on both sides of the coin, but I think it does play into that male ego a little bit as well, right? Where it's like, so if someone tells you, well, it was actually her fault, that might boost you up a little bit to a point where you're like, okay, right, so it was her fault. So now I'm going to explore that more because that makes me feel good and gives me a bit of status back, I guess.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It is a good point about the sort of flip side of this and the content that women might be seeing, post breakup, because I think it's a really important part of the conversation around gender roles and around feminism and around gender equality that we're sort of having, worldwide at the moment, which is to say that I think, often we talk about this manosphere kind of content as painting all women with the same brush and everything like that. But I think there's a particular brand of social media content targeted towards women that, as you say, does a similar sort of thing towards men in a way that isn't necessarily useful. And again, I can understand the motivation to sort of bring people on board with your perspectives and things like that. And I think there's a place for that kind of brand of feminism and content. But I guess, content that uses the language of toxic masculinity, for example, I don't think in the long run is ever actually going to be conducive to bringing the very men on side that we need to have on side in order to, achieve equality more broadly. So I think, if you mirror the sort of content that's painting all of the other gender as one thing, it sort of, in a way, weirdly kind of looks the same if you flip it. And I think, there's harmful content on both sides for sure, but also, hopefully useful content that we can hopefully promote.
Yeah, I think there's always something in everything, right? I think there's always a bit of a nugget. I think critical thinking is probably one of sort of a skill set that is lacked over sort of recent years in regards to algorithms and content being fed at you. It's sort of like,
yes,
well,
definitely.
this must be true because I'm consuming it and it's the way that the world is perceived to me. But if you look at something and go, well, I don't actually agree with that bit, but I like that bit, then that's cool. But there's not much of that anymore. It's quite scary how.
Yeah, that's an interesting point actually, because some of the research that has been done into, particularly young men's experiences of this sort of social media content, I think young guys are often a bit more discerning than maybe we give them credit for in terms of their capacity to, take parts of an influencer, parts of the narrative maybe they're pushing and ignore others. So, take Andrew Tate, for example, as the one that always comes to mind, as the sort of absolute pinnacle of the manosphere. I think for some young men, I think they can hear all the misogynistic stuff he puts out and sort of ignore that, but value other parts of what, maybe Tate is promoting in terms of wealth and fitness and status and all of this sort of stuff. Obviously, it's going to have, a subconscious effect over time and, reinforcing ideas of what's normal and what is expected. But I think, we obviously have a long way to go in terms of critical digital literacy and discernment of narratives on social media and things like that. But I think, it's not as simple as guys are watching these influencers and going, oh, this guy's amazing. I want to embody every aspect of what he is putting forth, because I think that's just not what's happening.
Yeah, the lack of credit that men and boys are given is actually laughable, really. I do some work in schools as well, and one of the things that does concern me is there is this underlying desire to retire parents or really help parents, especially in low social economic places, because they can see the sacrifice that those parents have made for them and they're trying to repay them, and that's putting pressure on 13, 14-year-old boys that I mean, the working world is already tough as it is, but then to add on the pressure of that as well, I think is quite scary. That's probably that's one of those ones where it's like, oh, that's a good thing, but it's also no one's talking about, well, how do you break that down? How realistic is that? What's the pressure on you as well? So it's deep. The more you go into it, the deeper it is, and I think there's a
Totally.
baseline of like that's good, that's bad, but then it's like actually now how do we break that down even more? Like you say, that literacy of what's next, what's the next step is probably what's still missing when it comes to social media. I think yes, most people know what's right and wrong, but it's that next skill set of
Yeah.
real.
Yeah, totally. And I think we just need a bit more grace and space, I suppose, for people to get it wrong, particularly young men to get it wrong, but also space to have, useful conversations around, say a young guy says something around dating or how to relate to women and things like that isn't necessarily, conducive with equality or respectful attitudes. We can't just shame him and call him toxic and tell him what not to do without then bringing him in afterwards and actually educating him and saying, here's why, your behavior is incompatible with the good, respectful human being that we know you to be. I think that is a response to young men behaving badly that, isn't happening enough. And I think, it's obviously challenging, like in schools, we're seeing teachers, there's research recently showing teachers' experiences of misogyny from male students and a real like rise of disrespect and things like that, which is obviously super challenging to deal with. And I'm not denying that, teachers, for example, should just have more empathy for the young men that are abusing them in the classroom. Like that is obviously not the case. But I think in the long run, where we can, I think a useful way forward is to call young men out, but then to call them in, and which is, I have not coined that term, that I stand on the shoulders of people before me, but yeah, call them in and then educate them and sort of replace the shame that might arise from being called out with a more adaptive emotion, which is guilt, which is behavior focus, which is, conducive to behavior change and growth and learning.
What do you think men and boys need in relationships and post relationships to reduce the scary figure around suicide?
Again, like I think it comes back to diversifying both support and connection, and not again putting all your eggs in one basket, but also where you derive your sense of self-worth from. Because I think really high quality, relationships that are really good for mental health are those where there is two partners, sometimes more, two partners and the relationship as a third factor. And so each individual partner has their own identity still, their own interests, their own things that they're doing, their own lives. And it just so happens that they're sharing those lives in cultivating a shared, relationship as a third, living being that needs care and compassion. There's this third thing that needs care as well. And so I think if there was one thing that I wish, everyone's superpower could be, or that we could, change around the world, it would be trying to help everyone find that balance of not putting just enough, but not too much into their relationship. Not as a sort of risk mitigation strategy of like, oh, what if it breaks down and I lose everything sort of thing, but more just the benefits that can come from having your own identity and having your own things going on while also having a relationship. I think we know that the two, again, can interact and can support one another in ways that can improve men's mental health, but also the health of their relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting, is it, going into a relationship, like trying to hedge your bets, but ironically, it probably makes the relationship more healthy longer term. That's sort of the idea. It's not a case of hedging your bets. It's how do you prolong that relationship as long as it can be.
Yeah,
which is a different way of looking at it, but it's sort of the same.
Yeah, totally.
Michael, in the men's space, what do you like right now, and what do you want to see more of in the future?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think for me, what's working well and what I like is the fact that we're witnessing a sort of shift in the onus particularly around men's mental health, the onus not entirely being on men themselves to fix the problems that they're facing. I think we're recognizing more and more the onus on the systems and the people and the structures around men, as I sort of said at the start, the capacity for those systems and people and structures to best support men and to create the conditions for men to look after themselves. So I think, an example of that, even the conversation that, everyone is having at the moment around gender role norms and what it means to be a man, all of that is, a way of understanding men's mental health and men's poor behavior in some cases through a lens of, okay, let's not focus on the individual for a second. Let's look at everything else that's going on around him and how can we try and tackle those sort of structures so that the individual behavior might change. Some other examples of that, I think, that are working really well is again, the work that I mentioned, I think I mentioned it, around training for mental health practitioners around how to best engage boys and men when they do seek help, and sort of reworking the health system in Australia. The government's putting heaps of funding into it at the moment, which is awesome, to best engage boys and men when they do seek help, because we know that dissatisfying experiences with help seeking can, predict reduced likelihood of seeking help in the future. And also in terms of breakups is another example. I think often the main, assumption a lot of people make when they see the relationship breakdown is such a risk factor for male suicide is that it's an issue of men not reaching out for support and not reaching out to their friends and not, reaching out to cope. But I think equally there's a responsibility on those friends that are reached out to provide support and emotional validation and, a safe space for men. That can be really hard to do. I think it's really hard to sit with male distress for some reason for a lot of people, particularly if it's a man that might be more traditionally masculine or might be someone that you would expect would not want to talk about their emotions and things like that. So, as an example, like something that's come up in pretty much every young guy that I interviewed for my research of the 22 mentioned that the main advice they got from some of their closest friends in some cases was just to immediately re-partner as quickly as possible, or just to get back on the horse, go out and hook up with someone as quick as you can, sort of thing. Everyone got that advice, but no one, it didn't resonate with anyone. No one wanted it. And in a way, that advice kind of reinforced this stereotype of men as emotionally immune somehow to relationship breakdown, or as, unbothered and unaffected by it. And so I think it's another example of where the onus can't entirely be on men to reach out more. I think equally, we need to train friends of men, colleagues of men, anyone around men to know how to best connect with them and to hear their distress and actually respond in a way that is helpful and doesn't just invalidate it. So I think, that's what's working well is this shift towards understanding what's going on around men and how we can improve that.
Amazing. Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure. If people have liked what they've heard and they want to find out more, let them know where they can find you or find some of your research, and I will leave the final thoughts with yourself.
Sure. So you can look me up on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn. If you look up Michael Wilson, University of Melbourne, it will probably come up. But also, I assume you'll have show notes. I'm happy for you to put my email in there if folks want to reach out. But otherwise, I'm very grateful to have been a part of this conversation. I always love, being able to talk about this space and my work in it. So thank you for having me.